Starving, a dying widow sold her wedding ring for bread. The baker gave it back. The ring sat on my flour sack all morning. Small thing. Plain gold band, worn thin on the inside where a finger had lived in it for years. She'd set it on the counter without a word, pushed it toward me with 2 fingers like she was sliding a poker chip, and said she wanted whatever it would buy. Bread, cornmeal, anything. I'd looked at her then, really looked. She was maybe 50, maybe less, hard to say, with the dust and the hunger both sitting on her face. Dress that had been washed so many times the pattern was just a suggestion. Hair pinned but coming loose at the temple. Eyes that weren't begging. That was the thing. She wasn't begging. She was transacting. Whatever pride she had left, she'd wrapped it around that one fact. This is a sale, not charity. I gave her 2 loaves, a slab of salt pork, a twist of cornmeal, and 4 bits in coin. She didn't thank me. She picked up the bundle, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. The ring stayed on my flour sack. My name is Harlan Coop, and I have been in Cuesta Piedra, New Mexico territory for 11 years. Came out from Ohio after the war with a trade and not much else. Learned baking from my uncle, who learned it from a German in Cincinnati who didn't speak enough English to explain why bread worked the way it did, only that it did, and that you had to respect the dough or it would punish you. I respected the dough. I built the oven myself, river stone and mortar, spent 3 weeks on it. Got it right on the 3rd rebuild. I'd had a wife once, Sarah. She died of a fever in the winter of '71, the 2nd year we were here. We hadn't been married long, didn't have children. After that I just kept baking. Wasn't nobility. It was just the only thing that required enough of my attention that I didn't have to think. The town used me well enough. They bought my bread, my rolls, my occasional pie. Some of them said good morning. The Mexican families north of the plaza were generous in the way people are when they respect quiet work. They'd leave a paper twist of peppers on the step, or a jar of honey with a cloth tied over it. I appreciated that without knowing how to say so. But I was alone in the way a man goes alone when he stops expecting anything different. Not miserable, just sealed, like a jar with the lid put down hard. I found out her name from Pilar Vasquez, who ran the dry goods and knew everything worth knowing in that town. Nora Ellsworth, widow of a man named Cal Ellsworth who'd had a small cattle operation 12 miles south along the creek. Cal had died the previous spring, a fall from a horse that should have been nothing, except it wasn't. Broken something internal that the doctor in Albuquerque couldn't fix. By the time Nora got word and got Cal to a real doctor, it was already over. She'd tried to keep the cattle operation going herself. 2 hired hands stayed on for a few months out of decency, then drifted. She sold the herd at bad prices to a man in Socorro who knew she had no leverage. The bank held paper on the land and they weren't feeling patient. She'd come into town to see if she could find work, any work, and she had about $4 left to her name and a cough that had been getting worse since February. That was what Pilar told me, leaning on her counter, not looking at me, in the way she had of delivering hard information without making it dramatic. She's staying at the Morales place, Pilar said. Dolores took her in. You know how Dolores is. I did. Dolores Morales was a woman who could not see need without filling it, which had kept her poor and kept her surrounded by people who loved her. Nora was sleeping in the back room that had been Dolores' late son's room, and eating whatever Dolores could manage, which was not much. I walked home with the ring in my coat pocket. Here is what I knew about rings. Sarah's ring was in a tobacco tin on the shelf above the oven. I couldn't have told you why I kept it there specifically, just that the warmth of the oven seemed right somehow, like it shouldn't be cold. I hadn't looked at it in maybe 2 years. I still knew exactly what it felt like. Slightly oval from where, a small rough place on the inner edge where a stone had once been set and fallen out before I'd ever bought it, because I bought it second-hand from a jeweler in Columbus who said it had belonged to an old woman and that it was solid. I knew what it meant when a woman put that kind of ring on a counter. Not just the money, the calculation behind it. The morning she must have sat with it in her hand and turned it over and done the arithmetic on what was left of her, and decided that the ring was the last thing that had value to anyone but her, and therefore it was the thing that had to go. I've thought about that morning she must have had. I've thought about it a lot. I went to the Morale's place on a Thursday, in the late afternoon when the bread was done and the oven was cooling. I carried a cloth sack, 2 loaves, a small crock of lard, a tin of peaches I'd been keeping because I liked peaches and hadn't gotten around to opening it. Dolores answered the door and looked at me the way women look at a man when he does something they'd been waiting for without telling him. "She's in the back," Dolores said. "She won't like it." "I know. You should tell her it isn't charity." "I know." Dolores stepped aside. The hallway smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke and the particular smell of a house where someone is sick, something beneath the other smells, something heavy. The door to the back room was open halfway. Nora Ellsworth was sitting up in the bed, which surprised me. I'd half expected her lying flat. She was dressed, blouse and skirt, hair combed, and she had a small leather-bound book open on her lap. She looked up when I knocked on the doorframe, and her face went carefully neutral the way a proud person's face goes when they suspect they're about to be handled. "Mr. Coop," she said. She knew who I was. "Mrs. Ellsworth." I set the sack on the chair near the door and took the ring out of my coat pocket and held it out. "This belongs to you." She looked at the ring for a moment without moving. Then she looked at me. "I sold it," she said. "I know I'm giving it back. I don't have the money to. I'm not asking for the money." She was quiet, the particular quiet of a person deciding whether to be angry. "That's charity," she said. "No, it isn't." I pulled the chair out from the wall and sat down, which I think surprised her, that I didn't stand at the door waiting to be dismissed. "I want to explain something to you, and I'd rather sit while I do it if that's all right." She closed her book. "My wife died in '71, I said. "Her ring is on a shelf in my bakery. I've thought about that sometimes, what would have happened if she'd lived and I died and she'd been left with nothing. What she would have done. She was practical. She would have made hard decisions. She wouldn't have wanted someone to give her things." I looked at the ring still in my palm. "But I think she would have wanted someone to give her back the things that should have stayed hers to begin with. Because there's a difference." Nora Ellsworth looked at me for a long time. She had gray eyes. I don't know why I noticed that just then, maybe because she was really looking at me, not past me or through me, but at me, the way people rarely do when they're that worn down. "Sit," she said, "since you're already sitting." I came back the next Thursday, and the one after. I told myself it was neighborly. Dolores always had the kettle on, and Nora was well enough to sit in the front room by the third visit, wrapped in a blanket on Dolores' horsehair settee. She was sharper than I'd expected, than I'd maybe let myself expect. She'd been a schoolteacher before she married Cal Ellsworth, 17 years teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas before she came west with him. She'd read more books than I had, remembered them better, could quote from them without showing off about it. She asked me questions, not polite questions, real ones, how the bread business worked, what my margins looked like, whether I'd ever thought about expanding, whether I had help, whether I thought I needed help. I hadn't had anyone ask me those questions in 11 years. "You should be making more," she said one afternoon. Matter of fact. Not a suggestion, an observation, like she'd done the arithmetic in her head and was just reporting back. "More bread. More of everything. You're the only bakery between here and Albuquerque. You have a stone oven that most men couldn't build. You have a skill and a monopoly, and you're making bread and rolls and pie when you should be supplying the mining camp and the hotel in Jarilla, and probably making hardtack for the army post." She looked at me with those gray eyes. "You've been letting yourself be small." I didn't say anything. "That's not a criticism," she said. "I let myself be small too. After Cal died, I kept telling myself it was enough to hold on, just hold on. And I held on until there was nothing left to hold." She looked at her hands. "I don't want to do that again." The cough got worse in April. Dolores came to the bakery one morning before I'd opened and told me Nora had been up most of the night. She said it in the simple way of a person who didn't want to alarm me and wasn't going to pretend either. "She needs a doctor," Dolores said. "A real one, not the man in town. He's no good for this kind of thing. There's a doctor in Santa Fe, used to be Army, nose lungs. Nora won't go because she says she can't pay." I didn't answer immediately. I was thinking. "How much?" I said. "The traveling, the doctor, maybe 2 weeks there." Dolores shrugged. $60 if she's careful." I had $60. I had more than that. What I didn't have was the right to hand it to her without her throwing it back at me. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about it while I was working the dough, while I was pulling loaves out of the oven, while I was making deliveries. I thought about what she'd said, letting yourself be small. I thought about the ring on the counter. Then I went to the Morale's place, and I sat down and I said, "I want to hire you." She looked at me from the settee. "As what?" she said. "As the person who does the thinking I don't do. The margins, the contracts with the mining camp, the hotel in Jarilla, the army post. You want me to be bigger, you can help me be bigger. I'll pay you a wage. The first advance goes toward your doctor in Santa Fe." She was quiet for a long time. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know. I could do that work from a bed." "I know that too. You're giving me the doctor money." "I'm paying you for work you'll do," I said. "There's a difference." She looked at me, that same long, gray-eyed look. I held it this time, didn't look at the window or the floor, just let her look. "You're not going to let me just quietly die," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "No," I said, "I'm not." Something moved across her face that I couldn't quite name. She looked down at her hands again, at the ring on her right hand where she'd moved it. She'd put it there after I gave it back, the left hand being the wrong place for it now. She turned it once with her thumb. "All right," she said, "I'll take the work." She went to Santa Fe in the first week of May. Dolores' nephew drove her in a wagon. I won't pretend those 2 weeks were easy. I kept working. I put in 14-hour days the way I had before, the same routine, and it felt the same as before, which meant it felt like nothing. I'd gotten used to Thursday afternoons. I'd gotten used to someone looking at me and asking real questions. I hadn't known I was used to it until it wasn't there. I sent a letter to the hotel in Jarilla while she was gone. I wrote to the Army post. I did it on her behalf, more or less, started the conversation she'd said I should start. It felt strange to do it. I'd gone so long not wanting anything to be bigger that the wanting felt unfamiliar, like a joint you hadn't moved in years. She came back on the 18th day. Dolores' nephew's wagon came down the main road late in the afternoon, and I happened to be outside pulling a flour delivery off a mule cart, and I saw it, and I stood there with a 50-pound sack on my shoulder and watched it come. She looked better. Thinner from the road, tired, but her color was better. The doctor had given her medicine and instructions, and told her she could recover if she was careful, which she apparently intended to be. She saw me standing there with the flour sack, and she raised one hand from the wagon seat in a kind of half-wave that was really just an acknowledgement. "I'm back. I see you." And something in my chest loosened like a knot working free. We worked together through the summer. She stayed at the Morale's place and came to the bakery most mornings after I'd done the first bake, and we'd sit at the work table and go over the accounts while the oven was still warm. She had a particular way of reading numbers. She'd go quiet, and her eyes would move, and then she'd tap the page once with her finger and say the thing, plainly and without drama. The hotel in Jarilla took a standing order. The mining camp took 2 standing orders. The army post took 3 months to decide and then took a large one. She never said I told you so. She didn't need to. By July, she was well enough to walk without wearing down too fast. We'd sometimes walk out to the edge of town in the evening when it cooled off, past the last adobe and out onto the plain where the ground was pale and the sky went on forever. She'd talk about Kansas sometimes, about teaching, about the specific loneliness of being the person in a town who knew things other people didn't bother to know. I understood that loneliness. I hadn't had a name for it before. One evening she said, "You know what I noticed about you the first time I walked into your bakery?" "No." "You had books on the shelf behind the counter. Actual books. Not a Bible and an almanac, books. Darwin and Tocqueville and a very battered Dickens. I hadn't thought about those books in a long time. I thought," she said, "whoever owns this place is a man who's been here with himself for a long time and made some kind of peace with it. And then I thought that's either a good thing or a sad thing, and I couldn't figure out which." "Both," I said. "Yes," she said, "both." We walked a little further. The sky was going orange in the west, the color it gets over the desert before it deepens into red. "I think you stopped wanting things," she said. "After your wife, you kept your head down and your hands busy and you stopped expecting anything for yourself." I didn't deny it. "I did the same thing," she said. "After Cal, and then after the ranch. I talked myself into a version of things where just holding on was enough, and I held on until there was nothing left. And then I walked into your bakery," she paused, "and you gave me back my ring." She stopped walking. So did I. The light was doing something particular to the desert right then, everything pale gold and still. She turned and looked at me, straight at me, the gray eyes steady. "I don't know what to call what I want to say," she said, "so I'll just say it. You're a good man, Harlan. You're a good man, and you've been letting the world not know it, and I'm not willing to let that continue." I didn't say anything for a moment. "You're not a dying widow anymore," I said. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her really laugh, a real one, unguarded, quick. "No," she said, "I am not." I reached out and took her hand, just held it. Her fingers were cool in the evening air, and she didn't pull away. She looked down at our hands and then back up at the horizon. "Ask me," she said quietly. "Ask you what?" "What you're already thinking about asking." I turned to face her, and she turned to face me. Right there in the last of the desert light, the town a row of low shapes behind us, the plain open in front of us, and her eyes on my face like she was reading something she already knew the words to. "I'm asking," I said. She squeezed my hand once. Then she stepped closer, and she put her other hand against my chest, flat, like she was checking for something, and she stayed there for a moment like that, her hand over my heart, her face level with my shoulder, the warm smell of her hair in the cooling air. "Then I'm saying yes," she said, in case that wasn't clear. We were married the following March. Pilar Vasquez hosted the dinner afterward because Dolores Morales said it was her right since she'd done the most work, and Pilar agreed only if she could supply the wine, and they both supplied the wine and neither counted how much, which was probably the right decision. I moved the tobacco tin from the shelf above the oven, kept it in the bedroom after that on the high shelf where Sarah's things were. I don't think she'd have begrudged it. I don't think she'd have wanted me to keep grinding. The bakery business, our bakery business, grew. Nora ran the accounts and the contracts and a good deal of the town's opinion of us besides. She had a way of talking to people, straight on and without waste, that made them feel like they'd been respected, which they had. She ran everything that way. Some mornings I'd look up from the oven and she'd be at the work table, the ledger open in front of her, her head bent, pencil moving. The light would be the low yellow light of early morning, and the oven would be throwing heat, and the whole bakery would smell the way it always smelled. And I'd think, this is what I stopped expecting. Not the business, Not the standing orders, her. A woman who saw what was here, the stone oven, the books behind the counter, the man who'd gone quiet for too long and decided it was worth something. Decided I was worth something. Who'd looked at me in a dying widow's back room and not let me just hand over $60 like a coward, who'd made me call it what it was and then held me to it. She didn't save me in a dramatic way. There was no drama. She just refused to let me keep being invisible, and she did it without making a fuss, and she stayed. That's not a small thing, I know that now. It's about the largest thing there is. There's still a ring on a shelf in the bakery. Hers, the plain gold band, worn thin on the inside. She moved it to her left hand the day we married, and she wears it there now. But the first morning after the wedding, she took it off and set it on the flour sack exactly the way she'd set it down the first time I saw her, and she looked at me without expression and said, "I want you to know I'm not selling it this time." I laughed. I don't know when I'd last laughed like that, like something had given way. "I know," I said. "Just so we're clear," she said. She picked it up and put it back on her finger. Clear. After all those years of sealed up, ground down, eyes forward days, a woman looked at me and called me good and stayed. I didn't deserve it more than other men. I don't say that. I just know what it did to me, what it made me want to be, standing out on that plain with the gold light going out of the sky and her hand in mine and the whole desert quiet around us. It made me want to be the man she'd already decided I was. That's worth more than gold. That's worth more than anything I know how to say.